day started like any other for Captain Sarah Knight, a woman whose reputation preceded her in the world of military operations. But today, in this small town far from any battlefield, she was about to face a challenge of an entirely different kind. Sarah had been accused of a crime she had nothing to do with, a situation so absurd that even she found it almost unbelievable. Yet, in the eyes of the law, she was guilty until proven innocent. The police arrived at her apartment without warning, and the moment she opened the door, they shoved her hands behind her back, handcuffs biting into her wrists. Despite the suddenness and the unfairness of it all, Sarah's composure never wavered. Years of Navy SEAL training had taught her to stay calm, to think clearly under pressure, and to control her emotions no matter what the circumstances were. As they led her through the busy streets toward the police station, she noticed the curious glances from people passing by. To them, she appeared like any ordinary civilian, perhaps a woman who had made a mistake. They didn't see the highly trained operative beneath the calm exterior. Sarah, however, took mental notes of everything: the layout of the streets, the distance between patrol cars, the behavior of the officers around her. Her mind, trained for tactical precision, started calculating possibilities, analyzing what might happen next, and preparing for the unknown. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. When she reached the detention center, the atmosphere was harsh and intimidating. The walls were gray, cold, and oppressive, the fluorescent lights flickering above. Sarah could feel the tension in the air. Guards moved about with a sense of superiority, confident in their authority, unchallenged in a world where they were in control. As she was shoved into a small holding cell, the metallic clang of the door echoed behind her, a sound that might have unnerved an ordinary person. But Sarah simply stood in the center of the cell, her posture straight, her eyes scanning the room, noting the position of the camera, the placement of the benches, and even the small cracks in the wall. Every detail mattered. Every detail could be important. The guards began to notice her calmness, and it frustrated them. They expected fear, resistance, or at least some sign of vulnerability. Instead, Sarah gave them none. She didn't cry, beg, or even plead her innocence vocally. She simply looked at them with quiet, unshakable confidence, the kind of presence that silently demanded attention. The guards exchanged glances, some snickering, some frowning, but all of them underestimated what they were dealing with. They had no idea who she really was, and that mistake would soon prove to be significant. As time passed, the guards started to talk among themselves, underestimating her even further. They assumed she was just another suspect, another person to intimidate and control. They joked and laughed, making comments about her being just a woman, or too weak to handle real pressure. But Sarah didn't respond. Every laugh, every sarcastic remark, every taunt was stored in her memory, analyzed for tone, intent, and character. In her mind, she was already observing the weaknesses, the overconfidence, the patterns of behavior that could be exploited if necessary. Despite the cold metal bars and the harsh environment, Sarah felt strangely in control. Her body might have been confined, but her mind was free, sharp, and alert. She understood that fear was a tool, both for herself and against those who might try to manipulate or intimidate her. She also recognized the value of patience. Acting too soon or too emotionally could reveal weaknesses, and patience, she knew, was often the most powerful weapon in situations like this. Other inmates watched her quietly, sensing something different about this woman. She moved with a calm confidence, even in the face of unjust treatment, and that quietly commanded respect. Some whispered to each other, others just stared, curious and unsure. The guards, however, remained smug, unaware that their assumption of superiority was entirely misplaced. Hours passed, and still Sarah said nothing. Her silence was a strategy, a way to observe, to analyze, and to prepare. Every glance, every movement, every word spoken by the guards was recorded in her mind. She considered possible outcomes, escape routes, and tactical responses, even if she didn't plan to act immediately. She was already planning how to turn the situation to her advantage. She was not just waiting, she was preparing. Even in these first moments of captivity, Sarah's professionalism and training shone through. She knew this was not a battlefield, but it was still a challenge, and she approached it with the same level of discipline and focus. While the guards laughed and mocked, she silently assessed, evaluated, and calculated, understanding that the real power was in patience, intelligence, and self-control. The irony was not lost on her. These people thought they held the power, yet they were blind to the fact that their arrogance made them vulnerable to someone far more capable than they could imagine. By the end of the day, Captain Sarah Knight had already gained the advantage, though the guards had no clue. They assumed fear would eventually show, that mockery and confinement would break her spirit. But they didn't know that beneath her calm, unassuming exterior was the mind and body of the Navy's #1 SEAL. Someone trained to survive, adapt, and overcome any situation, no matter how unfair or dangerous it might seem. And in that cold, gray cell, the first stage of the real test had already begun. The cell felt smaller now that Sarah had settled into its harsh reality. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced across the cold concrete walls. The guards, still underestimating her, began to make themselves at home in their little routine of intimidation. They thought of her as weak, ordinary, and easy to break. That belief gave them a false sense of confidence. They laughed loudly, shouting sarcastic comments as if the small, barred room belonged entirely to them. "What can you even do here, huh?" One guard sneered, leaning casually against the wall, his arms crossed. Another chimed in, "Yeah, think you're tough? Bet you can't even handle a single day in this place." Their words were meant to sting, to provoke some kind of reaction. But Sarah didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, and didn't show the slightest hint of fear. She merely sat on the cold bench, her posture straight, her eyes calm, and her hands resting lightly on her lap. The guards, seeing her silence, thought it was some kind of nervousness or lack of understanding. They didn't realize that Sarah was not nervous at all. She was calculating, observing, and waiting. Every movement they made, every word they uttered, was being recorded in her mind. Their arrogance, their overconfidence, their need to assert dominance. It was all visible to her trained eyes. She wasn't reacting yet because she didn't need to. Patience was her weapon now. They began to escalate. One guard slammed the metal tray with food down on her bench, the clanging sound echoing through the room. "Eat fast or maybe you'll starve here," he said, smirking. Another guard pushed a little closer, trying to block her path when she got up to stretch. The intent was clear. They wanted to intimidate her, to see a reaction, to remind her that she was under their control. But Sarah didn't move in haste, didn't respond with anger, and didn't show a single sign of submission. She simply observed them. The way they shifted weight from one foot to another, the way their eyes darted around to make sure no one else was watching, the small habits and gestures that revealed more than their words ever could. She was learning everything she could about them, and each taunt or action only confirmed what she had suspected. These guards were overconfident, underprepared, and not used to facing anyone who could outthink them. Other inmates watched quietly from their cells, curious about this woman who remained so composed under pressure. Some whispered, "She's not like the rest of us," while others simply stared, fascinated. The guards, proud of their perceived dominance, didn't notice the way the prisoner's attention had shifted. In a way, Sarah had already begun influencing the room without even speaking a word. Her calm and quiet confidence was an unspoken command for respect, and it subtly unsettled everyone who observed her. One of the guards, growing impatient, decided to get more aggressive. He stepped closer to Sarah and sneered, "You think you're tough? Huh? What can you even do here? You're trapped. You're nothing." He tried to make his voice deeper, to sound threatening, but there was a tremor in it, a crack in his armor that Sarah immediately noticed. She didn't respond with words. She didn't even need to. Her expression, steady and unwavering, spoke volumes. She made eye contact, just enough to remind him that he was dealing with someone far stronger than he imagined. Her silence began to frustrate the guards. They had expected fear, they had expected anger, or at least confusion. But Sarah offered none of that. Instead, she gave them the quiet power of observation. Every insult, every push, every mocking laugh was stored in her mind as data, information she would use when the time was right. They thought they had control, but in reality, they were revealing their own weaknesses to her, giving her every advantage. Time passed slowly in the cell, but Sarah did not waste a single second. She mentally ran through scenarios. If a guard came too close, if someone tried to provoke her into a fight, if an emergency arose, she calculated her responses with the precision of a soldier preparing for a mission. Her training allowed her to stay calm in stressful environments, to turn seemingly impossible situations into manageable challenges. And right now, her mission was simple: observe, assess, and prepare. The guards continued their mockery, thinking it was working, unaware of the effect it had on Sarah. Every sarcastic comment, every sneer, only gave her more insight into their personalities, their weaknesses, and their patterns. She noted the guard who was easily irritated, the one who always looked to others for approval, and the one who overcompensated with aggression. In her mind, she created a detailed map of the environment and the people within it, a mental blueprint of control that she could use if necessary. By the end of the day, the guards were tired, satisfied with what they thought was a successful intimidation. They believed they had broken her spirit, that the silence and composure she displayed was a sign of submission. But they didn't know that Sarah's calm was not weakness. It was a strategy. She had already begun to understand the dynamics of the cell, the behavior of the guards, and the layout of her temporary confinement. Every laugh they offered, every taunt they shouted, every mocking gesture was another piece of the puzzle that Sarah quietly assembled in her mind. Though it was only the beginning, Sarah had already gained the upper hand. The guards might have had physical control over her for now, but they had no idea that their arrogance had made them vulnerable. They mocked her, thinking she was powerless, unaware that beneath the surface was a highly trained Navy SEAL, ready to turn the situation around when the time was right. And in that dimly lit, gray-walled cell, a quiet tension began to grow, one that the guards could not see and one that would eventually change everything. As the hours passed, Sarah realized that reacting too quickly would only give the guards what they wanted. They were looking for a show of emotion, a sign of fear, or even a hint of frustration. But Sarah had learned long ago that the mind is often a more powerful weapon than the body, and she decided that observation was her first step toward control. Sitting quietly on the cold bench, she began to watch the guards with careful attention, noticing details that no ordinary person would see. She studied the way they moved through the hallways, noting which guards were confident and which ones hesitated when given orders. Some had predictable patterns. One always checked the corner by the stairs first. Another always turned his back briefly to talk to his colleague. These small habits, invisible to most, were crucial. Sarah's eyes flicked to the security cameras as well. She memorized their positions, the timing of their rotation, and the blind spots in their coverage. Her mind worked like a tactical computer, mapping the cell, the corridors, and every exit or point of vulnerability. Even more interesting to Sarah were the guards themselves. Their arrogance was obvious, but beneath it, she detected weaknesses. One guard, overly confident and loud, was easily irritated when challenged verbally. Another seemed to seek approval from his peers, needing them to validate his actions. There was also a younger guard who tried to look intimidating but occasionally hesitated when the older guards shouted commands. Sarah filed away all of these observations. If she ever needed to act, she would know exactly how to manipulate each one. While the guards strutted around, making sarcastic comments, Sarah noticed how predictable they were. They mocked her appearance, her calm demeanor, and even the way she walked. "Too quiet to be tough," one said with a smirk. Another added, "Bet she's never faced real pressure before." The irony was that the guards had no idea that their assumptions were completely wrong. Sarah was not only experienced in high-stakes operations but trained to remain calm under any threat. Their insults, meant to weaken her, were actually strengthening her understanding of them. Sarah also observed the way the guards interacted with each other. There was a hierarchy, of course, and subtle power struggles she could detect. The senior guard tried to assert dominance, but occasionally deferred to others when uncertain. The others competed for attention and approval, often interrupting each other to show they were in charge. To anyone else, this might seem trivial, but Sarah saw opportunity. The human factor, the emotions, pride, and arrogance, was something she could use to her advantage. Her observations extended to the routines as well. She noticed the guards' shift changes, when the hallways were less monitored, and even when they were likely distracted by conversations or paperwork. These small windows of opportunity were critical. In her mind, she was already planning how to maintain control of her situation and protect herself, even while confined. She knew that patience and careful observation could turn a disadvantage into an advantage, and she intended to use every piece of information she gathered. The other inmates had started to take notice as well. They were intrigued by her calm and calculated behavior. Unlike others who might have reacted to taunts with anger or frustration, Sarah's stillness suggested she was thinking far ahead. Whispers spread among the prisoners. "Who is she?" And, "She doesn't seem scared at all." Even without showing it, Sarah had begun influencing the dynamics of the cell. Her presence alone shifted attention, subtly changing the atmosphere. The guards, focused on mocking her, didn't see the small but significant effect she was having. At one point, a guard tried a more direct tactic to provoke her. He leaned close, his face inches from hers, and whispered a threat, expecting her to flinch or respond with fear. Sarah, however, simply met his gaze steadily. She did not flinch, did not step back, and did not speak. Her silence and unwavering composure frustrated him. He was used to compliance or visible reactions, and neither came from her. Sarah's eyes, calm but sharp, seemed to silently communicate a message the guard could not read. She was aware, capable, and ready for anything. Her mind continued to race, quietly analyzing the situation. Every word spoken by the guards, every laugh, every gesture was mentally catalogued. She imagined possible scenarios. What would happen if a guard tried to push her physically? What if they underestimated her intelligence? Or what if an unexpected situation arose? For every possibility, she planned a measured response, one that relied on strategy, precision, and her superior training. She did not need to act yet. She only needed to prepare. By the end of the day, it was clear to Sarah that knowledge was her first form of power. The guards might control the physical space, but she controlled the mental space. She knew the routines, the personalities, the weaknesses, and even the blind spots in the security. The arrogance of the guards was becoming increasingly obvious, and in that arrogance lay their vulnerability. Sarah understood that the time would come when she could subtly shift the balance in her favor, but for now she watched, learned, and planned. Even in the dull, harsh environment of the cell, Sarah felt a sense of control. She had not yet revealed her true abilities, and the guards had no idea what kind of force they were dealing with. To them, she was quiet, ordinary, and powerless. To Sarah, they were an open book, each action predictable, each taunt a clue, each routine a potential advantage. The stage was set, and she was already several steps ahead. In the cold, gray room where the guards mocked her, the first true layer of strategy had already begun, and Sarah's patience and keen observation would soon turn the situation in her favor. After hours of watching, analyzing, and quietly observing, Sarah finally sensed that the guards were beginning to push their luck. Their arrogance had grown to a point where they believed she was entirely under their control. The way they laughed at her, taunted her, and even tried to intimidate her physically gave her an unusual advantage. She could now begin to test them without ever revealing her true strength. She had been patient, calm, and silent, but now she decided it was time to let them sense, ever so slightly, that she was no ordinary inmate. It began with small remarks. One of the guards, growing bolder after a long day of mockery, leaned close and sneered. "You're just another helpless girl here. What can you even do to stop us?" His tone was meant to humiliate, meant to provoke a reaction that he could later laugh about with his colleagues. Sarah looked up at him with a calm but firm gaze. Her voice, soft yet steady, finally broke the silence. "I think you already know I'm not helpless," she said. It wasn't a threat, not overtly, but there was an underlying weight in her tone that immediately made the guard hesitate. The room seemed to pause for a moment. The other guards, initially laughing at her previous silence, now noticed a subtle shift in the energy. Sarah's remark had been carefully measured. It was enough to plant doubt in their minds, but not enough to escalate into immediate confrontation. Her voice carried authority, a quiet confidence that came from years of intense training and experience in situations far more dangerous than a small detention cell. For the first time, the guards weren't entirely sure of her. Even as she spoke, Sarah continued to observe their reactions closely. She noticed the way one guard's hands tightened into fists, the slight hesitation in another's voice as he repeated a sarcastic comment, and the flicker of unease in the eyes of the third. These were small signs, but to her trained mind, they were invaluable. They confirmed that her approach, calm observation followed by a carefully chosen, confident remark, was beginning to shift the balance of power, even if only slightly. The guards, though unsettled, tried to maintain their facade of superiority. They resumed their taunts, though with a little less confidence than before. "You think words will scare us?" one asked, his voice a little shakier than usual. Sarah didn't reply immediately. Instead, she allowed the silence to speak for her, giving them the unsettling feeling that she was always one step ahead, thinking, planning, and ready for anything. Her lack of visible fear made them second-guess their earlier assumption that she was weak. As the tension in the room grew, Sarah took another careful step. She subtly shifted her body to appear larger and more confident, using small movements that conveyed readiness without aggression. Her posture was deliberate. Straight shoulders, steady gaze, and controlled breathing. It was almost imperceptible, but it had a psychological impact. The guards, trained to assert dominance over ordinary people, could sense instinctively that something was different about her. There was a discipline and awareness in her movements that spoke volumes. One guard, frustrated by her calm defiance, decided to get more aggressive. He pushed a chair slightly closer to her bench, a minor attempt to invade her space. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't move backward, and didn't speak harshly. Instead, she simply looked him in the eyes, steady and unwavering. Her gaze communicated a silent warning. "I am aware, and I am prepared." The guard froze momentarily, surprised by the sheer control and quiet authority she exuded. It was a subtle victory, a demonstration that she could shift the dynamics without using force. Sarah also understood the importance of timing and patience. She knew that a rash reaction, a sudden display of strength, could escalate the situation unnecessarily and alert the guards to her full capabilities too early. Instead, she chose strategic restraint, showing just enough confidence to plant doubt while keeping the real extent of her skill hidden. This approach made her appear calm, unshakable, and thoughtful, a stark contrast to the overconfident guards who relied on intimidation and mockery to assert control. Meanwhile, the other inmates continued to watch in silence, captivated by Sarah's composure. They noticed how she maintained control over her own emotions while subtly influencing the environment around her. Unlike others who might have reacted with anger or frustration, Sarah's calmness made her a figure of quiet power. The guards, unaware of the effect she had on the prisoners, continued to operate under the assumption that they were still in full control. The hours in the cell passed slowly, but every moment was a lesson for the guards in subtle power dynamics. Sarah's presence alone began to shift the balance of authority, not with brute force, but with careful observation, patient strategy, and quiet confidence. Each small, controlled interaction with the guards chipped away at their certainty, forcing them to question their assumptions. What they thought was an ordinary inmate was, in reality, a highly trained Navy SEAL, quietly assessing, planning, and preparing for the right moment to assert her real strength. By the end of this period, it was clear that Sarah had achieved something remarkable. She had sent her first warning without escalating to violence or losing control. The guards were unsettled, beginning to doubt themselves, while she remained calm, in command of her own mind and actions. She had demonstrated that true strength often lies in observation, patience, and subtle influence rather than in overt aggression. In that gray, cold cell, a new reality was forming. The guards' arrogance had started to falter, and Sarah's quiet power had begun to make its mark. The next day, the guard's arrogance had only grown, fueled by the belief that Sarah was just another ordinary inmate, someone they could dominate with words, gestures, or minor intimidation. But Sarah had already studied their patterns, their weaknesses, and their overconfidence, and she was ready for the moment when their actions would give her the opportunity to respond. She knew that the first true test of her strength would come not from words but from physical challenges, and she was prepared to handle them with precision. It started with a small provocation. One of the guards, thinking he could assert dominance, reached toward her as she adjusted her position on the cold bench. His motion was meant to be intimidating, a subtle show of physical control. Most people would have flinched or reacted instinctively, but Sarah remained perfectly still. Her eyes locked on his, calm and focused, conveying a silent but unmistakable warning. She was aware, and she was not afraid. The guard, expecting a frightened response, was momentarily unnerved by her composure. Encouraged by this small hesitation, another guard moved closer, this one more aggressive and confident than the first. "I think you need to learn your place here," he said, pushing her lightly on the shoulder. Sarah shifted just enough to balance herself, her movements precise and controlled, and she subtly deflected his push without causing a scene. Her response was so smooth and measured that the guard lost his balance slightly, catching himself awkwardly on the metal bench. He glared at her, confused and embarrassed, while Sarah's calm expression never wavered. The other guards, sensing the shift, started to pay more attention. They had assumed that Sarah would react with panic or anger, but instead, she responded with efficiency and control. Each movement she made was deliberate, each action calculated to show competence without unnecessary aggression. In that instant, she had begun to challenge their assumptions, not openly, not aggressively, but through skillful deflection that revealed her physical capabilities. It wasn't just about defending herself. Sarah's training taught her to control situations with minimal force, using precision rather than strength to gain an advantage. When the guards tried to intimidate her further, she anticipated their moves, redirecting their energy in ways that were almost imperceptible. One guard, attempting to grab her arm, ended up off balance, his own momentum working against him. Another tried to block her path as she stood, only to find her calm and fluid movements making him hesitate. To the untrained eye, it looked almost effortless, but every action was the result of years of rigorous training and experience in high-pressure situations. What fascinated Sarah most was how predictable the guards were. Their arrogance made them careless. Their desire to dominate made them easy to read. She noted which guard was impulsive, which one relied too heavily on his peers' approval, and which one underestimated her the most. Every small misstep or moment of hesitation was a clue, a chance for her to understand their behavior and adjust her approach. By the time the day progressed, she had a mental map of their physical patterns, weaknesses, and reactions, an advantage she intended to use if necessary. The minor confrontations escalated slightly when a guard tried to push her aggressively into the wall. Instead of panicking or retaliating with force, Sarah used her body's balance and strength to absorb and redirect the movement. The guard stumbled slightly, caught off guard by her precise control. He hadn't expected that she could turn his own aggression into a disadvantage. The other guards began to notice, a subtle tension rising as they realized that she was not as easy to dominate as they had assumed. Even as the situation became more intense, Sarah's strategy remained consistent. Calm observation, precise action, and controlled presence. She was never reckless, never aggressive without reason, but every small defensive action she took sent a silent message. She was capable, aware, and not to be underestimated. Her calm, measured responses created a ripple of doubt among the guards. They had entered the cell thinking they had complete authority, but now they were unsure, cautious, and second-guessing their next moves. The other inmates continued to watch in awe. They had expected the guards to dominate completely, as they did with almost everyone. But Sarah's quiet skill and controlled movements were changing the energy of the room. Her confidence was contagious, a subtle demonstration of strength and intelligence over brute force. Even though she had done nothing overtly aggressive, the message was clear. She was not someone to be toyed with. By the end of this day, it became evident that Sarah had achieved a subtle but crucial victory. She had defended herself without losing composure, exposed weaknesses in the guards' approach, and demonstrated skill that none of them could fully comprehend. The arrogance that had dominated the room just hours earlier was beginning to falter. The guards, still unaware of her full identity, were now forced to reconsider their assumptions. In the cold, gray cell, a shift had occurred. Sarah had not needed to resort to violence. Her calm, measured, and precise movements had been enough to assert her presence and establish authority in a way that words alone could not achieve. The guards' mockery had begun to backfire, revealing their own incompetence to them and their vulnerability to someone trained far beyond their expectations. Sarah's patience, observation, and skill had turned a simple act of intimidation into a lesson they would never forget, though they still had no idea who she really was. For Sarah, this was just the beginning. She had weathered the first physical test with calm intelligence and tactical precision. The guards had learned, in small ways, that she was not ordinary, not easily intimidated, and far more capable than anyone could guess. And while they continued to believe they were in control, Sarah was quietly preparing for the next steps, her mind already planning how to fully turn the situation in her favor when the moment came. The cell had grown quieter that day. The guards, once so confident and mocking, were beginning to realize that Sarah Knight was no ordinary inmate. Every subtle movement, every precise response to their minor aggressions, had begun to unsettle them. Their arrogance was fading, replaced with uncertainty, though they still had no clue who she really was. They thought they had power, but in reality, Sarah had been observing, calculating, and planning the perfect moment to reveal the truth. That moment had finally arrived. It started with a quiet pause. Sarah had endured hours of mockery, taunts, and physical testing from the guards, all while keeping her composure flawless. Her calm eyes scanned the room as she measured the mood of the guards and the inmates. She could see the flicker of doubt in the eyes of the senior guard, the hesitation in the younger ones, and the subtle tension in the way they shifted their weight. All the small victories from the previous days had led to this, a chance to reveal her identity, to let them understand the reality of who they were dealing with. One of the guards, still trying to assert his dominance, leaned close and said, "You think you're some kind of tough girl? You're nothing here. Just stay in line, or you'll regret it." He smirked, confident that his words would provoke fear or submission. But Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she spoke clearly, her voice calm, steady, and filled with quiet authority. "You don't know me," she said. The words were simple, but the tone carried weight, like a subtle warning that things were about to change. The guards looked at each other, unsure how to respond. Their previous mockery had failed to shake her, and now her words hinted at something they couldn't comprehend. Sarah continued, speaking slowly, deliberately, revealing her credentials with a calm pride that left no room for doubt. "I am Captain Sarah Knight," she said. "I am the #1 Navy SEAL." For a moment the room seemed to freeze. The guards stared at her, their jaws tight, unable to fully grasp what she had just said. A Navy SEAL? The #1 Navy SEAL? The words sounded impossible to them, too extraordinary to believe. But Sarah's calm demeanor, her precise movements, and the controlled responses they had seen over the past days all began to make sense in a new light. This was no ordinary inmate. They had been testing someone who was trained far beyond anything they could imagine. The senior guard, trying to maintain his composure, cleared his throat and asked, "Prove it." His voice was shaky, betraying the nervousness he tried to hide. Sarah didn't need to provide proof immediately. Her actions over the past days had already demonstrated her skills. The way she had deflected pushes, controlled her movements, observed and anticipated every taunt and aggression. The guards had already seen evidence of her training, but now they understood its true magnitude. One of the guards, who had been particularly aggressive, took a small step back. His earlier confidence had completely eroded. The arrogance that had filled the room was replaced by caution and fear. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that they were not in control. The person they had been mocking and trying to intimidate was one of the most highly trained and capable operatives in the world. It was a humbling and terrifying revelation. Sarah's calm voice continued, almost conversationally, as if speaking to friends rather than intimidating foes. She explained some of her missions in a careful, measured way, without giving away classified details. She spoke of challenges she had faced, operations where precision and strategy had been the difference between life and death. With every sentence, the guards' disbelief grew, replaced by a mixture of awe and fear. They had underestimated her at every turn, and now they realized the magnitude of their mistake. The other inmates, who had been watching quietly, began to whisper among themselves. Their initial curiosity had turned into amazement. This woman, whom they had seen enduring harassment and intimidation, was someone they could hardly believe. She had endured, controlled, and subtly influenced the guards without ever revealing her true identity, until now. Her revelation transformed the room, shifting the perception of power dramatically. Even with her identity revealed, Sarah did not act aggressively. She understood that true power was not in brute force but in presence, knowledge, and timing. The guards, once mocking and overconfident, now stood uncertain, cautious, and hesitant. The fear in their eyes was not just of her physical capability but of the intelligence, strategy, and discipline that she clearly possessed. They now knew that any attempt to challenge her would be dangerous, even for those trained in law enforcement. By the end of that day, the balance in the cell had shifted completely. The guards who had once laughed and mocked her were now subdued, cautious, and wary. The prisoners had witnessed a transformation, from mockery to undeniable authority, from arrogance to respect. Sarah had revealed not just her identity, but the lesson that true power is earned through discipline, skill, and patience, not through intimidation or arrogance. In that small, gray-walled cell, Sarah Knight had quietly yet definitively changed the dynamics. She had turned fear into respect, mockery into awe, and ignorance into awareness. The guards would never underestimate another person like her again, and the inmates had witnessed what it truly meant to command presence without aggression. Though still confined, Sarah had won the ultimate victory. She had revealed her true self, and in doing so, had flipped the entire situation on its head. The day ended not with violence, but with a profound recognition of power. The guards, once smug and arrogant, were now aware that they had been dealing with someone extraordinary, someone far beyond their expectations. And Sarah, calm as ever, knew that this revelation was only the first step in taking full control of her environment, even in the confines of a jail cell. After revealing her identity, the atmosphere in the cell had shifted completely. The guards who had once laughed, sneered, and mocked her were now cautious, hesitant, and uneasy. The arrogance that had filled the room had dissolved, replaced by a quiet tension. Sarah Knight, the #1 Navy SEAL, had quietly established her presence, and the guards now realized that they were no longer in control. Yet Sarah understood that revelation alone was not enough. True control required strategy, calm authority, and measured action, not just the announcement of her accomplishments. She began by observing the reactions of the guards more closely. The senior guard, who had previously acted dominant and confident, was now stiff and uncertain. His voice, when he spoke, lacked the force it had held before. Another guard, younger and more aggressive, seemed frozen, unsure whether to follow orders or keep his distance. Every movement, every subtle hesitation confirmed what Sarah had already calculated. She held the psychological upper hand, but she knew she had to maintain composure and make every move deliberate. Her calmness itself was a tool of control. Sarah decided to assert her authority in small, subtle ways first. She shifted her posture, standing a little straighter, exuding confidence without aggression. She moved in the cell deliberately, showing ease and awareness of her surroundings. Each motion, though simple, communicated precision and readiness. The guards watched her with a mix of awe and fear. They had once thought her quiet and compliant. Now they realized that she was alert, powerful, and completely in command of herself. Her voice, calm and steady, carried more weight than any shout or threat could. When a guard tried to speak arrogantly again, she interrupted gently but firmly. I don't need to raise my voice for you to understand. The subtle authority in her tone made him pause. He had tried intimidation countless times before, and it had worked every time, but it no longer worked on her. Her quiet confidence communicated far more than aggression ever could. Sarah's strategy was clear. She did not need to dominate through fear or physical force. Instead, she focused on mental control, observation, and psychological presence. She noticed the guard's small nervous habits, the tapping of a foot, the quick glance at colleagues for reassurance, the subtle stiffening when she moved. Each gesture was a confirmation that the guards were already responding to her leadership. Her presence alone had begun to command attention and respect, even without her needing to act physically. She then subtly influenced the inmates as well. They watched with wide eyes, realizing that Sarah's calm and measured actions gave her a kind of authority that no one else in the cell possessed. She did not speak directly to them, but her presence alone sent a message. Patience, intelligence, and control could outweigh aggression and chaos. The inmates began to quietly respect her, noticing that even those who had previously intimidated others now hesitated around her. Sarah had changed the dynamic of the entire room, simply by being composed, confident, and strategically aware. The guards, still unaware of the full scope of her capabilities, began to follow her cues without realizing it. When she shifted position slightly, they instinctively stepped back, giving her space. When she sat down, they slowed their movements, their body language now cautious and deferential. Sarah was not giving orders verbally, yet the entire cell had begun to respond to her leadership. The balance of power, once entirely in favor of the guards, had now shifted subtly but unmistakably. Then came a moment of subtle testing. One guard, trying to regain some confidence, attempted to move closer, as if to assert control. Sarah looked at him calmly, her gaze unwavering. He froze, sensing that she was fully aware of his actions. He realized that any aggressive move could be easily countered, and yet he did not fully understand the extent of her skill. Sarah had achieved complete psychological dominance over him without using physical force. She had made it clear that she was capable of handling any situation, and that he could no longer intimidate her. By the end of this tense period, the transformation was complete. The guards were no longer mocking, laughing, or trying to assert dominance. They had learned, quietly, carefully, and reluctantly, that Sarah Knight was not someone to underestimate. Even those who had doubted her presence and abilities were now aware that she commanded respect, simply by remaining calm, aware, and strategically poised. Sarah had taught them that true authority does not always come from force. It comes from knowledge, discipline, and confidence. For Sarah herself, the day was a demonstration of the power of patience and observation. She had endured taunts, mockery, and minor aggression without ever losing control. She had revealed her true identity at the precise moment when it would have the greatest impact. And now, she had established full authority within the cell through quiet dominance. She did not need to raise her voice, show aggression, or demand obedience. The respect she commanded was earned through skill, intelligence, and composure. The prisoners continued to watch, quietly impressed. For them, Sarah had become more than an inmate. She was an example of courage, discipline, and mastery under pressure. They understood that strength was not measured solely by brute force or loud defiance, but by control of the mind, strategic thinking, and the ability to remain calm even in tense situations. By the end of this day, the cell that had once been ruled by the guards' arrogance was now subtly under Sarah's influence. They were cautious, respectful, and uncertain in a way they had never experienced before. Sarah had achieved the ultimate control not by striking or fighting, but by demonstrating intelligence, discipline, and unwavering calm. She had turned a situation designed to intimidate her into a lesson in respect and authority. A lesson the guards would never forget. In that small, gray cell, Sarah Knight had proven that true power lies in patience, observation, and strategic action. The guards' mockery had ended, the prisoners had gained respect for her, and she had quietly established dominance over her environment without raising her voice or using unnecessary force. It was a masterclass in control, leadership, and the quiet power of discipline. The day of Sarah's release finally arrived. After days of being confined, mocked, and tested, the evidence that proved her innocence had come through, clearing her name. But as she walked out of the cold, gray walls of the detention center, she did not walk as a victim. She walked as someone who had endured, observed, and emerged victorious. Every step she took was calm, confident, and deliberate. The guards, who had once laughed at her and underestimated her, now watched in quiet awe and unease. They had seen her strength, her patience, and her intelligence, and even now, they could not fully grasp the magnitude of who they had been dealing with. As she moved through the hallways, Sarah reflected on what had happened over the past days. The guards had believed that mockery, taunts, and small acts of intimidation would break her. Instead, she had used the time to observe, plan, and assert her presence in subtle but powerful ways. She had turned their arrogance against them without a single display of unnecessary aggression. Her mind had been as sharp and active as it had been in any high-stakes mission she had faced in the Navy. The other inmates watched silently as she walked past. To them, Sarah was no longer just an inmate. She was a symbol of intelligence, discipline, and quiet strength. They had witnessed firsthand how she had maintained control without violence, how she had commanded respect without demanding it, and how she had turned a situation designed to intimidate her into a display of calm authority. Their whispers followed her as she passed, a mixture of admiration and disbelief at her composure and power. The guards, meanwhile, avoided eye contact. They had learned a lesson they would not forget. Appearances can be deceiving, and arrogance can blind even those in positions of authority. Sarah's presence had shown them that real power is not always visible, that strength comes from patience, intelligence, and self-control, and that underestimating someone can have consequences, even if those consequences are only understood later. Outside, the sunlight felt warm and freeing after days in the harsh fluorescent lights of the cell. Sarah took a deep breath, enjoying the simple sensation of freedom, but she also carried with her the knowledge that her experience had reinforced valuable lessons about observation, strategy, and composure. She knew that patience had been her greatest ally. By staying calm, analyzing her environment, and understanding the psychology of those around her, she had turned a situation designed to weaken her into an opportunity to assert her control. Even in the simplest moments, walking past the guards, exchanging polite but firm words with staff, or acknowledging the other inmates with a subtle nod, Sarah demonstrated the kind of quiet authority that comes from true confidence. She did not boast or demand respect. It was earned through every action she had taken during her confinement. She had proved that discipline, intelligence, and self-control could outweigh force, intimidation, and arrogance. The guards who had mocked her were left to reflect on their mistakes. They had underestimated her from the beginning, assuming that her silence, calm demeanor, and composure were signs of weakness. But those same qualities had been her greatest strength. They had not realized that she had been observing every detail, analyzing every word, every gesture, and every flaw in their approach. By the time they understood what they had been dealing with, it was too late. She had already established her presence and authority, and the revelation of her identity only confirmed what they should have known. She was a highly trained, disciplined, and exceptional individual. As Sarah left the detention center, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had faced adversity head-on and emerged stronger. She had not only survived a difficult situation but had done so with intelligence, patience, and strategy. Every step of her journey in that cell had reinforced the principles she had lived by as a Navy SEAL: observation, patience, discipline, and calculated action. She had applied them not on a battlefield, but in an environment that tested her in entirely different ways, proving that these principles are universal and powerful in any circumstance. The experience also reminded Sarah of the value of humility in those around her. The guards' arrogance had been their weakness, and the lesson they had learned would stay with them long after her departure. Sarah had not needed to fight them physically to assert her power. Her calm, measured presence and strategic thinking had been enough. She had shown that true strength does not need to shout or strike. It can be quiet, precise, and undeniable. Walking away from the detention center, Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction and closure. She had turned a situation meant to intimidate her into a demonstration of her skill, intelligence, and self-control. The guards, who had once mocked her, had been forced to confront the reality of her abilities, while the inmates had witnessed a true example of courage and composure. Sarah's journey had reinforced a simple but powerful truth. Patience, strategy, and calm authority can overcome arrogance, intimidation, and adversity. As she disappeared into the streets beyond the jail, free once more, Sarah carried not just her identity as the #1 Navy SEAL, but the knowledge that she had handled a situation that tested both her mind and her discipline. The guards would never forget the lesson she had silently taught them. The inmates would always remember her presence, and she herself would walk forward, confident that strength is measured not only in action but in the patience, awareness, and composure with which one faces life's challenges.